Hi, my name is Mark Leggett. I'm the Executive Director of Research Data Canada, and you've joined today's five-part webinar series on data ownership. Today's session, as you can see from the slide, is on Indigenous data ownership, and we have a good attendance for today, but I think we'll go ahead and get started and take advantage of the full hour. So first of all, I would like to say I'm live and work in Prince Edward Island, so I'm speaking today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Abegwit Mi'kmaq First Nation. And I would also like to highlight the importance of all members of the research community, whether you're a researcher or you support researchers, in taking the time to understand and work under the guidance of the principles developed by our Indigenous communities, such as the international care principles and the Canadian First Nations OCAP principles. Very important regardless of your context. So with that, just a couple of housekeeping pieces. We encourage you to ask questions. I describe these panel sessions as armchair sessions, and our facilitator for today, Jamie Cedro, who I'll introduce in a minute, is going to facilitate the conversation. So I would encourage you as attendees to ask questions when they come up. And but if you can, please use the Q&A. It allows me to indicate when questions or comments have been mentioned or answered, so it makes it easier to kind of queue things up and pass them on to Jamie and the panelists. So we will try and reserve some time towards the end to respond to some of the comments in question. So please, for that, use the Q&A. And if there are any issues that you're having with the system, then you can certainly use chat. And just a quick mention of the other events in the series. So the data ownership writ large was last week. Today's session on Indigenous data ownership. And then in early November, we're having one on the data ownership from the context of higher education. So we have colleagues from both the Canadian College Institutes and Polytechnic sector, as well as the university sector, to speak about that. And then our fourth session is on standards and protocols. So this will discuss, in particular in the health context, ways to indicate data ownership and provenance and all those kinds of things in this context. And then our final session will be a session on open science and the open data context. And we'll have an element of presentation and armchair conversation as well with Richard Gold from McGill and Leslie Weir, who's the National Librarian and Archivist of Canada. So that's my intro piece. Now it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today. Dr. Jamie Cedro is at the University of Winnipeg, where she's a professor in the Department of Anthropology and director of the Masters in Development Practice Program in Indigenous Development. She's an Anishinaabe visitor from Ontario to the Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. She's a CIHR-funded Canada Research Chair in Health and Culture and the co-director of the Abezijawan Indigenous Research Lab. She leads the CIHR-funded Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research grant, which focuses on building research ethics policies and community-driven priorities within the 5 Indigenous organizations in Manitoba. She's also has a very collaborative approach to her research, which is primarily focused on Indigenous maternal and child health, and partners with many Indigenous organizations and communities throughout her practice. And her current project is fascinating. It's focused on the urban Indigenous doulas in Winnipeg and is jointly funded by SSHRC and CIHR. So with that, Jamie, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and welcome to all the participants. It's so nice to have such a high number of participants in a webinar, and this is one of the I guess one of the advantages of COVID is that we have panels like this that, you know, in Winnipeg, we would be doing them on our campus and would be, you know, limited to those who can physically come to our campus. But here we are doing webinars where we have people from all over the place able to participate. So this is, you know, really an opportunity, and we have three really exciting panelists. So I'll just introduce them one by one, and then I'm going to ask each of them to give some context to the work that they do and anything else that they think is relevant in terms of this conversation that we'll be having over the next hour. So first we have a recently doctored Stacey Allison Casson, and she's a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And she's an associate librarian in the Department of Student Learning and Academic Success at York University. Her work focuses on metadata, linked open data, digital culture, and Indigenous knowledge organization. She held the position of W.P. Scott Chair in librarianship and an endowed chair position from 2015 until 2017, where she researched the application of linked open data in libraries and archives. Stacey is joining the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto on November 1st. Congratulations, Stacey, as a contractually limited assistant professor in the teaching stream. Next, we have Candace Sudlovinik, and she is a young Inuk woman who grew up in Iqaluit in Nunavut. She is a graduate of the Environmental Technology program. She has been working in the enforcement field for the government of Nunavut and has most recently the federal government of Canada. She has been a part of the Karvik program since 2018, which she focuses on IQ and the relationship between Inuit researchers. Candace first joined the siku.org development team after participating in a training workshop in March 2019 and represented the Arctic Eider Society at the United Nations Forum Convention on Climate Change in June 2019. Candace often represents Siku in workshops, trainings, and conferences, and she has spoken at the United Nations, participated in multiple interviews, and trained numerous Inuit communities on the uses and technology of Siku, and she's going to show us a video following these introductions to explain that a little bit further. And finally, we have Lisa Binkley from Dalhousie University, and she is an Anishinaabe Algonquin and an assistant professor in the Department of History at Dal in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her research focuses on recouping Indigenous and settler women's histories through textiles. Because much of her work extends from objects currently held in museum collections, she investigates issues surrounding production, acquisition, and ownership, which are really interesting topics as an anthropologist in a museum context, certainly. She has just begun working alongside other Mi'kmaq culture, a local Mi'kmaq cultural center, as they work towards the repatriation of physical objects and the designing and building of new online platforms that will best house and control their community knowledges and histories in the digital environment. Furthermore, her project will create digital opportunities to share information with community members, educators, and the general public. So welcome the three of you to this panel. So maybe we will go back in the same order, and I'll ask you to provide anything else that your bio didn't, information that your bio didn't have, and anything else that you think is relevant to the conversation we're having this afternoon. So, so if we don't mind, we'll go Stacey, Candace, and then Lisa.
Okay, well, thank you, Jamie, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with you all, and you all virtually. I think it is a nice or advantage to be able to have these meetings where we can speak to more people. I'm coming to you today from Oakville, Ontario, which is just outside of Toronto, and I'm really grateful to be a guest on the lands of the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And the land that I live on and work on is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. And I also want to mention that we continue to be bound by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which bounds us all to peaceably share in the resources of the Great Lakes region. And in thinking about what I was going to say today in this sort of longer intro, I thought I would just maybe tell a little story to give context around some of my relationship to this work. And so I've been a librarian, professional librarian, since 2004, which is getting to be quite a long time now. And when I first started my career, I didn't really talk about or discuss my Indigenous identity in the context of my work. I really identified more as a music person, a music cataloger working in that area. And I think perhaps my story is one that is really indicative of the stories of many Métis people. My grandmother, so I've always known that I was Métis, but it was something my grandmother didn't want to talk about. It was very hard for her to talk about. She didn't teach her children her language, which was actually a mix of French and Anishinaabe. And so my dad couldn't speak to his grandparents and grew up removed from his community. And so that, and then it was something that I did find challenging to talk about with people and to use in my own work. And so it's only relatively recently that I feel that, you know, I've spent some time you know, reconnecting with that story, of talking to some of my family members, of thinking about what that means. And again, I think this is a story of many Métis people where our stories are hidden or in between or are not very visible. So the reason I'm talking about in the context of research data or research materials is that how we think about where documents are or where data is or how that data is held and deployed is really contextual and also sometimes hard to find. So a lot of the stories of Métis people or documents connected with Métis identity or sovereignty are held by governments or universities or archives, and they're actually quite hard to find because it's not a story that is told in really explicit ways in a lot of times. So, so in the last few years, my work has really been making that identity a bit more public, or is more public, and then also just thinking about what my responsibility is in carrying those stories and thinking about that identity, and also making those materials more accessible. So this is where my work sort of meets these ideas around both metadata and how we think about how documents or materials or data is held and what that means to communities and what that means also very highly connected to sovereignty and sort of nationhood. And that's why I also want to bring up the connection today, I think, between some of the things we're talking about in connection to sovereignty and to data and the situation of the Mi'kmaq fishers right now in Nova Scotia, and how that idea of nationhood is still one that really challenges lots of organizations and governments in Canada. So I think I'll stop there, but I think that what I want to bring out today is this connection between sort of librarianship or libraries and archives and holders of data and systems and things around sovereignty and identity.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stacey. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this. So next we'll move to Candace, and I know she has a video queued up for us to watch also. Thank you.
Thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Candace. I live in Iqaluit. So I work for the Arctic Writers Society, which is a nonprofit that's based in Sanikiluq. And today I'm going to be talking to you about this app called Siku. And Siku in Inuktitut means sea ice. So there's been a lot of changes that have been happening here in the Arctic, especially involving our ice conditions and everything. And so the Arctic Writers Society is based in Sanikiluq, which is a community in the Belshore Islands in Hudson's Bay. And they've been seeing a lot of changes that have been happening, especially around their ice conditions. And so one of the features on Siku is that you could post various types of ice conditions and everything, and to kind of be aware or inform even other community members if there is dangerous ice in your area. And you can take a whole bunch of instruments and measurements and stuff to kind of create a baseline because Inuit have always been told that our traditional knowledge is anecdotal because we don't write anything down because it's always been oral history. And we all know that researchers are very good at writing things down and keeping records and everything. And so Siku is actually helping Inuit and communities create a baseline for the communities with some of the things that they're seeing. And so Siku also helps in self-determination research and environmental stewardship. But we're actually going to play a little video that will explain Siku very well. So
Just one sec here. All right, so hopefully people will be able to see this and hear it.
Siku, the Inuktitut word for sea ice, connects communities across the Arctic. Siku, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network. Siku is a mobile app and web platform created by and for Inuit, providing tools for weather, ice safety, and hunting stories, as well as knowledge transfer and language preservation.
The weather's changing, the ice conditions is changing, and when we're driving a snowmobile or walking, we have to think before we get on that ice. So this one's no good. If you try to pass by through this, you'll lose your snowmobile.
Siku puts Indigenous knowledge and observations front and center alongside weather and safety services, including sea ice products, tides, marine forecasts, and silent imagery. This lets hunters share dangerous and changing conditions with their communities using their own language and knowledge systems.
We used to get our information on 5 different websites.
Now with Siku, all that information is in one place, also with the information from the elders and hunters.
Siku includes profiles for wildlife, sea ice, and traditional place names in multiple dialects that are taggable and act as living wikis of Indigenous knowledge. Using the mobile app while you're on the land, posts such as hunting stories and GPS tracks can be recorded and uploaded to Siku when you are back in your community.
Oral history has been a big part of the Inuit tradition. Nothing was written, so everybody just had a good memory.
With the Siku, we are providing new ways how the Inuit knowledge and science can work together.
Siku helps you document the data that has always formed the basis of Indigenous knowledge and mobilize it for use in community-based monitoring, guardian programs, and self-determination in research and environmental stewardship.
With Siku, we get to decide how we share our knowledge.
Siku is a safe place to share our hunting stories.
As the only social media platform putting Indigenous rights first, Siku includes privacy settings tailored specifically for Indigenous knowledge, ensuring that no one can use your data without permission.
You become a hunter because you keep practicing and you follow, and you let the elders take the lead.
You still need your harpoon to stay safe on the ice. And now with Siku, you can mobilize your knowledge, connecting hunters, elders, and youth for the benefit of future generations.
I think Inuit clothing, the feathers that we use, and traditional tools combined with technology and the tools of today's modern youth, and you put them together, it would be amazing.
Integrating Indigenous ways of knowing with a suite of modern technologies. Siku, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network, now available for Android, iPhone, and online at siku.org. Brought to you by the Arctic Ider Society.
There we go. Great.
Thank you for that. And we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the stewardship and the data ownership that you can on the app later. And there's a whole bunch of opportunities with that. And I think it's really great that traditional knowledge and technology are working together to benefit communities.
Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you so much, Candace. And now, last but not least, Lisa.
Great, and hello from Halifax. I'm on traditional Mi'kmaq unceded territory, and we're all treaty people. So I just want to thank the Mi'kmaq for welcoming Anishinaabe to come and visit and work on their territory. So I am really pleased to be here as well, and just find this whole topic very timely, especially during COVID. And I think it's given been given a lot of fuel when we start to understand how Indigenous communities are are now practicing this idea of sovereignty with their data research and their data information. And I think the idea of traditional knowledges and the way information is passed on through oral histories, I think the digital side of component of it is particularly interesting because it's allowing that perpetuation and the preservation a little bit in a more, I'm gonna say modern sense, but it combines those aspects of historical traditional knowledges with the digital platforms that we're working on. And I'm pleased to be working with the local Mi'kmaq community as they're starting to recoup some of their data, some of their physical objects as well, and repatriating it into their own ownership. And it's really exciting to watch that take place.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Thanks for the excellent segue also to the first question. You brought up the term ownership, and we know this is really, a loaded term. It came, we've heard a lot about it, over the last 2 decades with OCAP. So I want to start with that. Does the term ownership resonate, in your opinion, in Indigenous communities, or is there another way of thinking about research data or traditional knowledge? So I don't know, Lisa, if you want to start, since you were since you just recently.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's particularly interesting at this point too, and I'll give you a little bit more context about my work because I am working out of Dalhousie University in Halifax with the local Mi'kmaq communities. It's refreshing and empowering to see how they are taking on this innovative new position and role, and the idea that they're actually driving this new form of data ownership is very exciting. I think when I first started working with them as well, they were curious about why, how we could get a relationship going with the university. So I think it's like that with a lot of, between communities and larger institutions, there's a little bit of maybe wariness or caution. And I think once we started talking about the purpose of the institution's role in their projects, I think they were reassured that there is this support for them to own their own data, to control it. And I think you mentioned OCAP, which I think is a really important part of all of this, and understanding, how these communities can go about this without challenges from the bigger institutions, but rather the institutions trying to support them. And I think when I first talked to them, they were, kind of questioning what I wanted in return from it, or what the university wanted in return from it. And I said, there's really no agenda on our part other than creating a better line of communication between the institution and the community. And also, what Stacy was saying earlier, how many of us have these missing components of our own histories. So it's allowing even community members this opportunity to learn more about their own cultures, learn more about their own histories, and not be necessarily afraid of these bigger institutions being involved. And I think that the idea that there is this component of ownership, it just really supports the direction that the community wants to go. And if the university can be a part of supporting that direction, I think that's always a benefit to everyone.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Stacy or Candace, do you want to jump in and provide any reflections on this concept or term ownership and what it means for Indigenous communities?
I might just jump in, if that's okay, Candace, with the relationship with the thinking, since I come out of a university context also, and just before this webinar today, so one of the roles I have currently is chair of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Indigenous Matters Committee, and in that committee, we come together as a group of librarians primarily, but both Indigenous and non-Indigenous librarians coming from a variety of kinds of library contexts. And we actually were just wrestling with this, this concept of ownership of a project that we have, because, I think part of the challenge, we don't want to have own something, but how do we work in a collective when so much work frequently when we cut of institutions or organizations is always couched in terms of ownership of an institution or organization. And so how do we do the work, the kind of work that we want to do in the way that we want to do it, given our relationships with our institutions and organizations that we have to work in and through? Because I think that so one of the challenges as I see is that lots of organizations and institutions, including universities, are not well set up to think differently about ideas of ownership, especially when it comes to certain kinds of projects, because sometimes there is a little bit of or maybe not even a little bit, but there is a bit of competitiveness between universities when it comes to certain kinds of work. And so when the interest is in advancing community, well, I would say just broadly, health in terms of being able to have access to kinds of documents or being able to work in certain kinds of ways, but yet we are still a lot of times bound to work in universities or within certain kinds of funding bodies. And so I think that presents a challenge when we talk about ownership. And so that to me is something that's really important to consider, is how do we do work in collaborative and community focused ways when we are still bound to work through certain kinds of often quite colonial kinds of structures in universities and organizations. And so that's one of the I think really I would say pressing issues, or something that sort of continually we kind of bump up against when we're trying to do work in collaborative ways, because again we're sort of bound by these structures. And something I'll want to pick up maybe on a bit later is also capacity building in amongst Indigenous communities as well, because that again we're kind of dependent on the capacity of universities or other kinds of organizations to partner to do some of this work.
Thanks, Stacey. Now, Candace, you're not in a university, but I'm wondering if you can also provide some reflections on this term ownership and whether it resonates with the communities that you work with and with the Arctic Eider Society. And I just saw, even in that little 3-minute video you showed us, you could see some of the woman talking about, the elder talking about some of this stuff, right? Like even in that, so I imagine, the Siku app has a lot of, has picked up on a lot of these themes already.
Yeah, so I could talk to you about like the perspectives of Nunavut. So there's been a lot of research that's been happening in Nunavut for a very long time, with a lot of researchers coming up to kind of interview elders and other community members to kind of get more information for their research. And so a lot of times when they would interview elders or other community members, they would kind of take the knowledge and their information. And then most times that wouldn't be seen by the community again, or they wouldn't be able to kind of get a copy of the report or anything back. And most times with elders, when they're sharing their knowledge with somebody, they're hoping that that knowledge will be shared with the community. So that their community could get that information too. And that hasn't been quite happening in the past. Things are changing now, but that has been a lot of issue because Inuit have often had to kind of fight for their ownership of that data and knowledge back. And the way sometimes communities would get like that information in a scientific paper, but scientific papers have such jargon that a lot of community members won't be able to understand kind of what is being said or how their knowledge is put into the paper. And so Siku is giving people ownership and access and control for their data and Indigenous stewardship. And so you actually control who has access to your data, and you're actually able to pick the many different types of data ownership that you want. You could put it as Indigenous stewardship, or you could put it as, you could say your locations and like a whole bunch of different things. You have so much control with your data and your ownership on Siku. And that's something that is amazing, because if you wanted to share a few certain posts, like let's say you just wanted to share all your ice condition posts, and if you're making ice observations or dangerous ice conditions, and if you wanted to export all that information, you could send it to one person if you wanted. But with Siku, you can't take anyone else's post or take their information without their permission. So it's definitely providing a very big sense of ownership of your own data, which is, I think, really amazing.
Yeah, really, you know, a great example of the use of technology around addressing some of these challenges relating to data ownership. So, so I want to go back to what are some of those challenges. What do you see overall, and maybe Candace, you want to speak to this, and you kind of did already, from your different stakeholder communities, the communities that you're from, and how are they addressing them? So Candace, you talked about the role of Siku in doing this. Are there other ways that the communities that you work with are attempting to address data ownership issues? Either Candace or any of the other two panelists.
Is it okay if I think about that, maybe Lisa?
Yeah, you bet.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can jump in. I think some of the challenges that we've seen in the past have driven how we might go about addressing some of these data ownership principles, especially, you know, I think when I came into, I've only been at DAL for a little over a year now, and I'm, you know, historically from Ontario, when I first approached the community in Mi'kma'ki, and, you know, really just wanted to get a sense of where they were going with their project. A big part of it was understanding or sharing the ideas of ownership. What was the purpose I was getting involved? Who's going to own the data? Who's going to control it? And I think what I've seen from this community is this very strong sense of what their purpose is in driving it. And I feel as though I'm in the fortunate position, maybe different than being as a librarian or such, or in that library, in the purpose for capacity building, where the community has this wonderful opportunity to drive the whole project. And my purpose as a participant in the program is to really glean some of the knowledge from them, in that sense where, you know, I'm not going in and taking information and bring it to the university. I'm working with them to understand their positions, their directives, how they're going about this ownership process and this repatriation process, so that I can bring that information back to the university and say, you know what, as we move forward with, you know, the dirty R word research or collaboration with Indigenous communities, this is going to be a wonderful model to grow from. What are some of the challenges with that? I think for this part, I think watching the community trying to move forward with their project, you know, funding's always an issue, and trying to work with those funding agencies that fund on a very colonial system. So trying to get this idea across that you might not necessarily tick all the boxes in this logical, rational order of colonial, requirements, where it's more of a community-based initiative. It's certainly from the grassroots up. It's based on what the community sees, and that's not always necessarily following the regulations of a government funding agency. And then also working with the university groups, where you're saying, we're not just parachuting in for this short period of time, it takes a long time to build these relationships, and we don't necessarily, we cannot go by these deadlines that are imposed on us. I think those are some of the real issues, and trying to, it's been a pleasure to watch how this community is, has thought of all these things and has considered these things as they're moving forward. Like, I feel that I've entered into this wonderful partnership with these super competent people, and that haven't been historically given this credit for being able to plan these bigger initiatives in the past, where they've been maybe recipients, or they've been followers, where this to watch this leadership from this community has just been so impressive. And I think that will set some excellent baselines in the future, and I think that will help us overcome challenges as we move forward with further projects in mind.
Thanks, Lisa. And it's, I really find it interesting when you have communities who are Indigenous organizations who are really leaders in this field, and being able to share that with other communities and organizations kind of nationally is really important. I'm involved in a CITR funded project called the Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research. I think the PI on the East Coast is out of Dalhousie. And really, there's a project in each region across Canada, and really this is the focus is really trying to address some of these really pervasive issues in research in Indigenous communities, and having communities be the drivers and be the ones to kind of step up and take the lead. So I'll ask Stacey if you were wanting to weigh in on some of the challenges that you're seeing for Indigenous communities around ownership.
Sure. So I'm going to speak again a little bit from my perspective of from looking at the intersections, I think, between Indigenous communities or research data and the library sector or archival sector. And there's a couple of projects that I work on, short projects that have to do with data and metadata. And so, when I was thinking about this question, there's a couple of big things. And to me, it's infrastructure in sort of writ large in all kinds of ways. And how, and also, I guess I also want to stress, I think it maybe is training and education of the people who work with those infrastructures and with those organizations. I know that many people working in the library, archive, university sectors, for example, want to do better and want to work in more collaborative ways and to are really contending with these issues, but we have a lack of systems and abilities to be able to bring those intents together with the systems that we have to work in and encounter every day. So I would say, for a big piece is actually around opportunities for training and education on some of these matters, and also understanding how these is, it's not just pieces of data, or it's not just documents that we have in collections, that these things are connected to real people and real issues and really vital issues around how people impact people's lives in really tangible ways. And so I'll just offer that as a area that I would really like to see growing. So two things, I guess, is one piece is the sort of infrastructure pieces around technology. We know that, this wonderful example of the app is amazing. And so how do we think about how that impacts communities in a wider way, thinking about those pieces of technology that allow for the deployment of ideas of sovereignty and of ownership or control around data and materials, and then also ensuring that people working in organizations and institutions have access to the training and the understandings where they will be able to bring that as part of their daily work. So it shouldn't be something that sits separate, that you do because you're working on a project or you have access to this grant, but that this infuses all of the kinds of work that people are doing around research and data and organization. So I think that's, for me, part of it, that it isn't something separate that we activate at particular times when we're working on a particular project, that it goes across organizations and all aspects of that work. That's a bit broad, but.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Lisa, I see your mute is off. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if you don't mind if I add something, unless Candace has something to say. I was just going to add to that and build on it. And I think this idea of ownership also, you know, extending from the home community, where what we're doing is we're designing a platform that's going to have access at different levels. So the primary focus will be access for community members in remote locations, so that they can access some of their historical knowledges, you know, and as a learning tool too, because I have many students that come into my classroom at Dal and say, you know what, I don't know about my own history, like Stacy was saying. So because there's so much focus on us to, you know, offer up some of the information, and being a Anishinaabe in Mi'kmaq territory, it's not my, you know, I can't do that fairly. And I want to reach out to the community and say, you know what, I need some tools to help me, you know, engage some of the Mi'kmaq students that are here. But by having this ownership on different levels, so the community decides what historical knowledges or oral histories or elders' teachings that they are going to make accessible to their community members. We're going to do a second tier of access where educators, non-Indigenous educators that want to reach out, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, want to reach out to community and say, you know, we need some proper tools for teaching in the classroom. And the community says, this is, as owners of that material can say, this is what we want to share with you to teach in your classroom. And then a third level would be access point where it is open wide to the public. So that, again, the community emphasizes that ownership over what data they want to have out there in, you know, cybersphere or whatever. And I think that level of ownership is just almost reaffirms that the community is, it's empowering for that community.
Thanks, Lisa. So we're hearing a lot about tools and technology as kind of drivers in a way to attempt to address some of these issues of ownership. So Candace, you know, because you've given us such a really interesting example of a best practice around collecting data and kind of who owns it, who has access to it, is there anything you wanted to add to that conversation?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So one of the ways that SIKU is actually addressing data ownership is, you know, the terms and conditions that everyone agrees to when you sign up for anything. That's actually kind of in a way that respects Indigenous knowledge. Like when you agree to these terms and conditions, you agree to respect Indigenous knowledge, and that self-determined research, education, and environmental stewardship through accessible tools, language, and services. And permission for informed data stewardship and ownership over intellectual property. And so that's the really big one that we've been focusing on a lot with this app, especially, is the ownership over intellectual property. And integrity for information, facilitating safe travel, knowledge transfer, language, and cultural preservation. So one of the cool things about SIKU is in the features, you actually have a whole bunch of options for your data ownership and privacy settings. And so this could be, you could have it as your default setting, or you can kind of have it as a post by post case kind of thing. So you're actually able to control the location visibility. So let's say if you have your like kind of secret berry picking spot kind of thing, you could choose to either show the location or you could mask it. So you could say it's kind of in this big area over here kind of thing. And so another cool thing about that is you could post about your post privacy. So if it's low post privacy, then anyone could see your information, all the extra information that you're able to put in there. Or you could have it as kind of like media information where people are able to see your post kind of on the feed, but they can't click more details to see more information that is kind of hidden. And so I think the best part is the Indigenous stewardship and the open access stewardship option that we have. So with Indigenous stewardship, you're allowing communities and other Indigenous organizations to be able to use your information if you wanted. So let's say if you've been posting a lot about like these trails that you've been taking, or these ice condition posts, or all these wildlife observations over, let's say, a span of like 10 years. And then if your local Inuit organization wanted to kind of build the baseline of how things have been changing, they'd be able to go onto Siku, and whoever has Indigenous stewardship clicked on their thing, they'll be able to take that information from multiple people, and that would be kind of like a good baseline and kind of like good, so you can actually see all that information and data on there. And then there's open access stewardship, which means like anyone can take your information if you wanted, but they're still going to have to ask you to use it for permission as well. And so I think that that's a really good way to address a lot of the issues that we're having, because you have full control over your data and your information, and you have full rights to give it to a person, or you can deny a person. And that's what you agree to do when you click agree on the terms and conditions, which is really interesting, which is good.
That is really interesting, Candace. And I'm just thinking back to somebody else's comments. I think it was Stacy who made it about capacity building. And so as I'm listening to you talk as someone who is older than you, and is a kind of a technological dinosaur, like how are community members trained in terms of how to use the app? Like, is this something that is accessible from like, you know, young people to the very old? And kind of what are the ways in which that kind of support is given?
Yeah, definitely. So actually, what we were doing a lot last fall and have been doing until like since COVID started is we actually do a lot of workshops in communities. So we have kind of like a hand group of people, and then we kind of teach them how to use the app, teach them about all these features and all the reasons why for all these features and everything. And then we kind of do like a 2-day training session with them. And then we do like practice posts and everything. And at the end of the workshops, we actually do a community presentation as well, so that the whole community is aware of this new app that was just launched. And then if anyone else wants to stay and like learn more about the app, we take our time, we show people about the app as well. And the people who actually came to our workshops, we're actually encouraging them, if you know any friends or family that would be interested, you can show them how to use the app. And it's actually not too hard to use. I've seen like elders having no problem using it. And like, if anyone's like kind of tech savvy or like, you know, like the younger generation, they'll be able to figure it out pretty quickly. But we also on our Facebook page have a whole bunch of videos on how to make certain posts and like different features and stuff. So with all this information is available. And we were actually, because like when COVID started, we were actually doing kind of Facebook Live presentations on community pages, just to kind of like reach more people, especially like during springtime when everyone's out hunting and out on the land and everything. That'd be perfect time for people to be making posts and stuff. So I don't think it's too hard to use. Like you could just like kind of play around with it and figure it out pretty quickly. So I have seen elders like in their probably like 70s using it, no problem. So.
Okay, that's really cool. Okay, so we don't have to, we only have 10 minutes left. So I have a third question, but I'm wondering if we could just kind of tailor it down. So if you could just think about if somebody was going to ask you for kind of one lesson learned, how can, as a broader Canadian research community, how can a broader Canadian research community work together with Indigenous communities to foster Indigenous data ownership? Could you maybe think of just like one thing that you would say to the broader Canadian research community, one kind of piece of advice based on your experiences? I don't know who wants to go first.
I can go first. I think just as a baseline, I have to say that I think highly of that OCAP program that's in place. And I think this should be something everybody takes, the course in the university setting, at least. That I think that it's a good baseline for people to start thinking about data ownership, data control, you know, not to be cliched, access and possession, like the OCAP principles. And I think I learned a lot from it, even though I'm already working in the system. And I think it's just something that would help us bring us all up to this baseline anyways. At least we can be all speaking that same language.
Thanks, Lisa. Candace, is there one piece of advice you think you would offer to the broader Canadian research community in terms of how to better work with Indigenous communities around data ownership?
I think the one advice I would give is that to acknowledge that the data and everything that you're using belongs to the Indigenous peoples, and that if you're going to be referencing any of your research papers, or if you're going to be doing anything, to fully acknowledge that. And if they want that information back, you'll give it back to them in a way that they'll understand, so there's not too much jargon or anything, but just to fully acknowledge and appreciate the information that you've been given.
Thanks, Candace. And so, Stacey, the question is, if you could offer one piece of advice to the general Canadian research community on how to work with Indigenous communities, particularly as it pertains to data ownership, what would you say to them?
I could say so many things, but if I was going to say one thing, I think I would.
Yeah, I think Stacey's been having connection problems, so she may drop off and come back in again. Maybe Jamie, just one word while we wait to see if Stacey comes back. I think a good response to your last question can be seen in the Q&A in the chat, and that is nobody has really had a question or a comment. So I think one way that we can respond in the context of your question is to take a respectful listening position, like I think all of our attendees have today. I think that they've been quite obviously enthralled with the conversation and in learning mode. So I think that's a good way for all of us to respond to the opportunity to engage with colleagues from the Indigenous communities. And we did get one comment, which was simply a highlight. Again, I think maybe calling out the funders that coming back to one of your comments about building these relationships takes time. So I think the comment from one of our attendees was that the funders need to do just that. Take the time to engage in the conversation and learn from the communities that where research is happening or that are doing research. So it's and that doesn't mean just big funders like the tri-councils, but the universities themselves that are of course part of that funding circle.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, hopefully Stacey will be able to join us for the last few minutes, but I know she was having technical issues. I will say, like, I've taught Indigenous research methods at the graduate level for many years, and one of the things that students will walk away and say is a lot of these principles as it pertains to data ownership and other kind of principles generally are just good research practices, right? So I think, for the Canadian research community generally, really investing time into understanding kind of different research methodologies, ways of doing research, ways of knowing and learning and doing really is just about good, is just really good research practice generally. So Stacey's joined us again. I know you've been having a bit of technology issues. So if you wanted, we still have a few more minutes left if you wanted to finish your thoughts.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say reliable internet, broadband access strikes me as being particularly important. So I was going to say is just really urge that this is a vitally important. I think everyone is done so well to talk about that, but also to just stress that these issues are not something that comes as an add-on to after you're done regular work or as specific projects, that we all have a responsibility to be bringing these issues to our everyday work from all levels, not just from administrators down through organizations.
Thank you very much. So we have some comments, not necessarily. I do see one question that came up. How do you deal with the contradictions involved with data sharing, open access, and restrictions on data ownership and use. Does anyone want to respond to that question? I'll read it again. How do you deal with the contradictions involved with data sharing, open access, and restrictions on data ownership and use? That's a pretty heavy question from Fraser Taylor. Anyone want to respond?
I think that it's, again, I'll just attempt. We had a panel on this at York a little bit earlier this week, and one thing is to consider, again, thinking about communities, but also different levels of control. So I think like the app we've been hearing about, and I know that there's other, and Lisa's work, that there's ways of implementing systems and repositories, for example, that actually control levels of access, so that bringing things like traditional knowledge labels into the context of that work, and also think about, heard earlier this week from a researcher at York around barriers to even just publishing open access in terms of things like fees and the ways that research works. So it's a few thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. There is a question for Candace. The question is, was it a community member that created and developed the Siku app?
Yeah, it was actually the community of Sanikulak that created this app with the Arctic Guider Society. And initially, Siku was created just for the community of Sanikulak because they were having a lot of issues with fresh water being dumped into Hudson's Bay because of the hydroelectric dams in Quebec. And so that dump of fresh warm water in the wintertime was causing a lot of issues and stuff. And so that's kind of why Siku was created, so that they could, when they take a whole bunch of instrument measurements and ice condition posts, that they'll be able to like kind of create a baseline with that. And then when they kind of had like the prototype of it, they thought, oh, we might as well share it with like everyone else, kind of thing. And so it was definitely created by the community members, again, like by and for Inuit, but we have a lot of people that are also interested in using the app that are not Inuit, and we're definitely interested in doing workshops or talking with other people, or kind of like, if you want certain things on the app or different features and stuff, we're definitely open to do that as well.
Great, thank you. Oh, here come the questions. So here's one from Larissa. How can you ensure long-term indefinite preservation of and access to Indigenous knowledge and data with forward technical capability? I know Larissa, and that's a pretty heavy question also, Larissa, so thank you. I'm glad I'm not a panelist. Does anyone want to step in and answer that?
I can try to speak to that. Not that I'm going to have an answer, but this is something that comes up all the time when you're thinking about data storage or data access. So again, I think it comes down to money. I think there's got to be something in place right from the get-go on how you're going to either store your data, and with this idea, a thought of archiving your data, and also the changes in technology. I think that's what she's sort of getting at there, but I think it all comes down to money for that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so there a question for Stacy directly. So this is probably kind of a library question. Do you see connections with your work in linked data, open or maybe not, and Indigenous data specifically?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Roger. So yes, there is actually a couple of projects that I'm working on that are connecting. So linked data is about creating semantic relationships between data points. And so some of the research that I've been looking at more recently is thinking about ways that we encode context of sovereignty in the ways that we describe documents and data, so that those relationships are documented there. And also I'm looking at a project working on Métis identity and documentation, and thinking about how I would, working with community, obviously describe those documents and create connections between, one of the things we don't do in libraries so well is talk about time and place necessarily. So connecting people, time, place, to be able to sort of look at movements and pinning certain kinds of documentations to also kinship networks as well. So that's a very, very brief answer, but so I guess the short answer is yes.
Okay, thank you, Stacey. And you know what? We're out of time. It's 1 o'clock. So I think we're going to leave it at that. I'd like to thank Lisa, Candace, and Stacey, and also the RDC group as well for hosting this webinar. I mean, I think we could be here all day, but we're probably all kind of dealing with Zoom fatigue, but this was really well worth the fatigue. So thank you to everyone. And I look forward to hearing more about all of your work in the future. So thank you so much. And thanks to all the participants for participating.
Indeed.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Jamie, for facilitating. And I should also have said thanks to Robin Nicholson for organizing the event when she was our RDC intern. So thanks to all, and apologies to the folks whose answers we couldn't respond to, but I'm sure some of our colleagues would be more than happy to respond if you want to reach out by email. And the recording will be available, and anybody who registered, whether you attended or not, will receive an email with the link to the archival recording. So with that, thanks again to all of our panelists and Jamie for facilitating, and we'll continue the chat. Cheers.
Okay, bye everyone.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.